When people talk about the language that is used in the army and they say how unacceptable it is, these are normally men in a war zone. Language is going to be different than if you're working in Croydon Council. And
I don't know, I mean, that is a war zone, mate.
Yeah. But I mean, that is a good point. But it's
you meant in a cafe in central London.
Yeah, in a cafe in central London, or if you're going to the theatre, it's going to be different because you're in a highly pressurised situation where it's literally a matter of life and death. You are going to be desensitised because of what you've been exposed to. So your language is going to be, dare I say, more industrial, and your humour is going to be far more dark.
Absolutely. And I think this issue of language is actually fascinating in terms of how the new woke ideologues are impacting that in the armed forces. So to give you a few examples, they warn everyone in the MOD against what they call microaggressions. So the armed forces is meant to be a pretty aggressive institution, I would hope. And
you'd think so, wouldn't you?
I would hope macroaggressions would be something to be celebrated, particularly against our enemies. Yeah. But microaggressions are very unacceptable. And one of the examples they give is sort of misgendering someone or labelling them in the wrong type of pronoun. Obviously, total bollocks. When you have, I suppose, there are very, very few trans people in the armed forces, but one would hope that people are just respectful to each other and you don't have to obsess over asking whether what someone's pronoun is. One of the stories I actually reported last year was in the Royal Navy. Their sort of trans guidance for all sailors said that you had to introduce your pronouns before any interaction. And that, again, was immediately withdrawn by the defence minister. When I exposed this thing, it was like immediately I got a comment from the MOD saying, we're reviewing the document, we're withdrawing it. Why did it happen? Why was it there in the first place? The other issue about language is again, this gender-neutral obsession. So you can't say rifleman, you can't say you can't say serviceman. In the RAF, they changed, a few years ago, they changed ranks to be gender-neutral. You can't say airmen anymore, you have to say aviators. And this issue of one guy in the army said to me, he's never seen someone a worse bollocking in Sandhurst in the military kind of education, army kind of education establishment than when someone said the word rifleman, and a senior commander completely sort of came down on this guy with a ton of bricks, completely unprofessional way, because it wasn't gender neutral. And then later on, there was a commander who, again, was giving kind of educational instructions that this guy told me, we published in the Telegraph, where he was saying, you must use gender-neutral language, you can't say all these terms like rifleman and so on. And then immediately he forgot about that, subconsciously, presumably, and he used the exact same terms that he just said that you shouldn't use. So it's quite ironic. I think, again, it's this kind of weird imposition of you just have to say the thing, you have to kind of repeat the almost like religious mantra, you have to, and then you sort of go back into normal mode and you kind of forget about that because really it is totally irrelevant to day-to-day kind of interactions with people. So yeah, that is definitely a concern, this use of language. There has been a massive imposition in recent years trying to make sure that all language is somehow gender neutral and no one's offending each other.
And it's also the issue of meritocracy as well, because if you take something like the SAS, the reason the SAS as a fighting force is so famous is because they are the best of the best. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you come from, you are the elite.
Absolutely, and I think this issue of standards and lowering standards, frankly, in order to boost diversity, I mean, the security checks is one policy, but this applies across a lot of public institutions, somewhere like the Met, somewhere I've been speaking to people in the Met recently who are again concerned that they're lowering the fitness tests in order to enable more women to join. And I think, again, that causes issues where you see videos of women who are trying to arrest people in the street. You might have 3 women in London trying to arrest sort of a big, tall bloke, and he gets away and he can put up a fight. And you kind of have these kind of overweight women who, unfortunately, it looks quite embarrassing for them. And I feel quite sorry for them, really, that they've been put into this situation. So I think things like the bleep tests and so on have been reduced, I think, to a certain extent in the Met. I think in the armed forces, again, there are some accusations that they're lowering physical fitness standards in order to boost diversity of particularly to have more women in the forces. And again, it's that whole lowering of standards. As you say, you want to be the best. That's the point of the SAS, for example. I think the SAS is probably quite protected, I hope, in most ways, because their levels of their kind of fitness standards are so high that I think it's very, very difficult for women to get into those institutions. And I've spoken to actually people who have been training recently, trying to pass their fitness levels to be in the special forces. And there was actually one woman, I think, in my sort of contacts regiment who did actually manage to almost pass, who just almost just failed. And she would have been the first woman ever to get into this kind of special operations regiment. So yeah, I think again it's a concern, and I hope that our allies aren't looking at this stuff like in France and other European nations, in NATO and Poland, for example, who are massively investing in their armed forces, concerned about the threat from Russia. And they're laughing. I suspect they're laughing at us. And the same in China, the same in Russia. Why are we doing these things to undermine our operational capabilities?
Do you know what's interesting about this? We have more meritocracy in something like football, which is basically entertainment, than we do in the in the service that is there to protect us from foreign threats and enemies, and the police, which is there to protect us from domestic enemies. We've lost the plot, haven't we?
I think this issue of meritocracy is really important, and it doesn't just go to fitness standards and the Met and the armed forces, but it also impacts promotions across all of Whitehall, where people are basically being selected based on their identity and their characteristics rather than whether they're good at the job or not. And one of the things that I've spoken to lots of civil servants about, particularly in various departments like the Home Office or the DWP or wherever, is that suddenly they go up for a promotion and they're asked about all of these issues around diversity and well-being and HR kind of topics, rather than whether they're good at the job or not. And what the civil servants have is something called success profiles. Now, this is what all civil servants are measured against in terms of recruitment and promotions, internal promotions. And I think in one of the success profile documents that I've studied, there's 12 mentions of diversity. Now, you don't need to be obsessed with diversity to be an immigration officer or to be an advisor in the Department for Work and Pensions or to be someone who is coming up with education policy. That's totally irrelevant. But suddenly this has become something which they're all measured against, and they've all got to come up with a load of, again, like almost semi-religious bollocks, coming up with using the language, using all of the things that are in these success profiles in order to get ahead. And unfortunately, I think we've seen a real over-promotion of people who are very good at using the HR woke language in their applications, in their job interviews, versus the people who are potentially more apolitical, more focused on their normal roles, I suppose. One of the stories I reported on was in the BBC. Something really interesting. It's very, very difficult to get sources in the BBC. I think that's such a liberal metropolitan institution, frankly, where there are very, very few people. Maybe I'm wrong, and people at the BBC watching this may disagree with me, but there are very few people, I think, in that institution who, frankly, are concerned about these woke issues. There are lots of Jewish people who are worried about the BBC's coverage of Palestine. I think to a certain extent there are kind of TERF-type gender-critical people in the BBC. But so it's very rare to find someone who will actually speak to you on the record or off the record about this stuff. But I did find someone recently, and it was some fascinating conversations. And one of the things that they gave to me was this HR hiring document, which said that all candidates in this major non-editorial department had to be asked a question about diversity. And the sort of hiring manager was given the correct and the incorrect answers. So it literally said, quote, don't hire the candidates who are, quote, dismissive or derisive of diversity and inclusion and surrounding topics. So even if you question any kind of topic around diversity and inclusion, immediately you're disqualified from a position within the BBC. And people wonder why the BBC has a more liberal left bias, frankly, and a more kind of woke bias amongst all of its programming and all of its output. And I think, frankly, it's to do with, partly at least, to do with its hiring processes and its hiring practices. Now, the BBC claimed to me in their press office that this was an old document from 2022. Yeah, very old.
It's probably been upgraded to publicly defenestrate anyone who's dismissive of diversity.
Honestly, it's mental. They sent to me the updated version of the document, which is a public thing, which says everyone has to champion inclusion. Why should everyone have to champion inclusion to work at the BBC? Anyway, but the point is that document was still in place, despite what the BBC were telling me. I knew it was still in place. I knew people who were applying for jobs in the BBC who were being asked these questions. So they completely lied to me. And this is something that happens all the time. Civil servant press officers, people across public institutions will openly lie to my face on phone calls and sometimes even over email, over my reporting in order to try and shut down my reporting. And this is something I found that's really interesting, is they'll try and shut you down. They'll tell you that what you're doing isn't woke. Actually, it's very